Hi everyone, welcome to Reason with Science. I'm your host Jitendra. This is a conversation with Nina Jablonski. She is a professor of anthropology at the Pennsylvania State University. Her work focuses on evolution of human skin and STEM education. In this conversation, we talk about origin of human races, science of skin color variation in non-human primates, imagined reality of skin pigmentation, and major questions in the science of skin today. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thank you for listening. Okay, so hi Nina, welcome to today's conversation.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Jitendra. I'm really thrilled to be speaking with you about such an important topic for people.
Yeah, so I wanted to start with how a primatologist got interested in science of skin.
Well, I will be honest and say that it was an accident. I was several years ago, many years ago now, in the early 1990s, I was working at the University of Western Australia. I was teaching anatomy and human biology to mostly medical and dental students. And one of my colleagues asked me if I would be so kind as to substitute for him in a lecture that he had to give to a class in introductory human biology on the subject of skin. And so I said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. I'll be happy to do that. And so I prepared a lecture to the best of my ability. And I tried, this was back in 1991, I tried very hard to find information on the evolution of skin and skin color because I thought students would be very interested in this important set of topics because they were studying human biology. And I was shocked that there was so little information available, and what was available wasn't very good. So I was mystified. So I stopped there, but then just a few weeks after that, I was in a seminar given by one of my colleagues at the University of Western Australia Medical School, and she was talking about an important phenomenon that I could see that was connected to the evolution of skin pigmentation. And so literally I was sitting in the back of the seminar room, sort of jumping up and down in my seat because I realized that I had had an insight into a problem that people hadn't had before. And so starting that day, I had this in the back of my mind that I wanted to investigate it because I knew this was a topic of great importance to people from a biological and medical perspective, and also from the perspective of human social relations. And so over the course of, it took another 10 years almost before we accumulated enough information to be able to publish on this topic. We began to publish in force, and really we haven't left the topic ever since. It's been a very rewarding topic, and one in which there is almost inexhaustible interest.
Exactly, yeah, and of course we'll discuss more of your impressive work, but before that, let's try to highlight that problem of the social problem in general. I mean, we can think of skin as the major organ or the largest organ in terms of senses, but then it has been used as an like a sort of weapon or source for discrimination, right? So what
Absolutely.
what is the basis of this discrimination?
Well, what was so interesting when we look at the history as opposed to the evolution of this issue, what we find is that many of the associations of skin color with groups of people or races of people, many of these associations are not very old. They date from about 250 to 300 years ago, and most of them were established in Europe by natural historians, philosophers, and others who were genuinely interested in trying to understand human diversity. But they didn't have very good information available to them. And also, most of these individuals were what we would call European white males today. They came from a specific time, a specific cultural background, and they had very clear ideas about their own cultural superiority. So when they began to learn from various reports from travelers and explorers about the diversity of people outside of Europe, they began to, first of all, collect this information and partition people according to what was the primary descriptor, which was skin color. People were reported to be red, yellow, black, as well as European off-white. So we end up getting these named groups and eventually races of people that are based on color. And these categories, and there's a long history to the use of these categories were reinforced by many political and economic forces from the middle of the 1700s onward. And that led to these categories really having a life of their own and being proliferated and even justified using subsequent science. So when we look back on the history, what we see is that these original framers of human groups or typologies of race, including Linnaeus, Buffon, Kant, Hume, and many others, these people had very limited information, but they had a lot of attitude. And they applied this combination in a most unfortunate way, because really the template of racial distinctions that they created bore no relationship to what exists in nature, to the endless, almost endless spectrum of human variation and diversity that exists in nature. But these categories became institutionalized, proliferated via books and the media of the time, and they quickly became cultural and political institutions in many countries. And so here we are in 2022, still trying to deal with race categories that were installed in the middle 1700s. This is a really bad situation.
Yeah, another man-made situation, we can say. But what were the views of, for example, Charles Darwin on this kind of issue?
Darwin was, of course, a very good observer of nature, and he recognized that there were great variations in skin color around the world. And of course, in his own travels as a young man on the Beagle, he saw peoples of many different skin colors. And he opined, he thought deeply and opined about this in The Descent of Man. And interestingly, what he saw as the major factor that had contributed to differences in skin color between groups of people was sexual selection. He actually thought that some groups preferred mates of one particular color, whether that be light or dark, and that it was primarily sexual selection that had driven the diversification of human skin color. What Darwin didn't realize, but I think he would have loved to have understood, was that the diversity of skin color has a geographic pattern that is related to the pattern of solar radiation at the Earth's surface, and more specifically to the pattern of ultraviolet radiation at the Earth's surface. He didn't know this, and so we can't fault him for having made a fairly simple mistake. He was a good observer. He recognized that human skin color varied, but he assigned, as we can now see, a wrong agent for the production of those skin color differences.
Yeah, I mean, so far we've been talking about relatively recent history. Let's go a little bit back and, talk about something which I think that still people are trying to digest, that our ancestors evolved in Africa.
Yes, and this is such an important thing for people to embrace, that our lineage, the human lineage, diverged from the lineage of our African ape cousins about 8 million or so years ago. And we know this from a variety of fossil as well as molecular genetic evidence. And since then, these two big lineages have been going in their separate directions. Our African ape cousins have stayed in equatorial Africa, mostly in deep equatorial forests, whereas the human lineage underwent just enormous diversification over the course of millions of years into many more open and non-forested environments. The key point here is that by about 2 million years ago, when humans, and we can really speak of these early members of the genus Homo as being humans, they were walking and running around in open environments. They were looking for food. They were actively foraging. They might have been doing some hunting. Certainly they were scavenging. And of course, they were being chased by predators as well. So they were active bipedal humans in open equatorial, very sunny environments. Under these conditions, two important things happened. Firstly, we lost most of our functional body hair. Our primate cousins are quite hairy. By the time the genus Homo evolved, we had lost most of our body hair as a means to facilitate the cooling of the body through the evaporation of sweat from the surface of the skin. At the same time, we gained a lot of eccrine sweat glands, so we became much sweatier primates. And very importantly, at the same time that we lost most of our functional body hair, we had to compensate for that by gaining another kind of sunscreen. We never think about hair or fur being a good natural sunscreen, but it actually is a marvelous one. And when we lost most of the sunscreen on our bodies, the hairy sunscreen, we substituted that with permanent pigmentation, which acted as a natural sunscreen. And in this, we evolved high concentrations, permanent concentrations of the pigment eumelanin, or simply melanin, in our skin. A consummately superb natural sunscreen that's used by many, many vertebrates, invertebrates, and even some fungi to absorb ionizing and ultraviolet radiation, as well as visible light. Eumelanin imparts beautiful colors to many vertebrates, as well as provide extraordinary protection against the dangerous effects of ultraviolet radiation.
Yeah, interesting. And so, I mean, when we talk about Africa, Africa is huge, right? So have we managed to somehow sort of localized it more where we were, where our ancestors were in the parts of Africa?
Yes, this is an excellent question. And of course, you know, the fossil record is not perfect. In fact, it's far from perfect. But we can see from the weight of fossil evidence that we have a lot of fossils close to the equator in Kenya, Tanzania, in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia. Some of our earliest fossils of the human lineage are concentrated in these areas. And then we also have important fossils in South Africa and in the north of Africa. So depending on the time period, we find fossils of the human lineage all over the place. One of the most important things is that in the evolution of our lineage, and most specifically Homo sapiens, our own species, beginning around 300,000 years ago, we find evidence of modern humans not only in equatorial Africa, but elsewhere in Africa, in far northern and extreme far southern Africa. And we know or we can reconstruct from our understanding of ultraviolet radiation at the Earth's surface at these times, that people at the extremes of Africa would have actually experienced less ultraviolet radiation than those living at the equator. And so in the early phases of our own species evolution, we would have actually undergone some changes in skin pigmentation. What was the originally dark pigmentation in the genus Homo and in Homo sapiens would have undergone some natural selection and changed to less pigmented or partially depigmented skin in the extremes of the continent of Africa. So there was a lot of microevolution going on in the genus Homo with respect to skin pigmentation, even before we consider populations beginning to move out of Africa, Homo sapiens populations, let's say around 80,000 years ago.
Yeah, but considering the slow process of evolution, and of course it's known that sapiens tried to move many times out of Africa, right? The question is that, were there migrations, or is there any evidence which reports to the migration close to the equator first, and then like later on we expanded to the other parts of the world?
Certainly people were moving around in equatorial latitudes within the tropics a lot. And here, again, we have to trust our geochronological reconstructions of human evolution. And in some cases, we have not such a clear idea of exactly who was where when, but we know that in the evolution of Homo sapiens, beginning around 300,000 years ago, that people were moving around actively in tropical Africa, as well as getting into the extremes of Africa. And one of the important points to note here is that throughout this process, as human populations are dispersing, we're not talking about big groups of people. We're talking about relatively small groups that are pursuing groups of animals, herds of animals, in order to stay alive. And population genetics has been very useful in showing us just the effects of population size on the genetic differentiation of populations, because as many groups moved around within Africa and then outside of Africa, we see the effect of small populations, founder effect or genetic drift, that begins to have actually a dramatic effect on the speed with which genetic changes are occurring in populations. And this is something that has really sped up the evolution of pigmentation evolution in humans.
Yeah. So what is the advantage of being a naked ape?
Well, there are many advantages of being a naked ape. First of all, you can stay cool for a long time when you're active, provided that you have enough to drink so that you can continue to sweat copiously when you're moving around. You can remain active for hours and hours of time. And not necessarily running at a marathon pace, but steady walking with a little bit of jogging, such as you would see in people going out for a long walk, foraging or hunting for small game, or occasionally chasing large game. So being naked and sweaty is a terrific advantage because it just gives you a lot more mileage. It's like you have a charged battery that can keep going. You don't get overheated. And also, there are other advantages that we've taken, that we have exploited in human evolution. These have to do with our use of skin, of naked skin, as a canvas for self-expression through body painting, cosmetics, and most especially tattoos. Naked skin in the hands of a sentient bipedal thinking ape is a wonderful canvas for self-expression. And so people have been affixing all sorts of designs on their skin, permanent and non-permanent ones. And so this nakedness affords us these incredible vistas of self-expression that we did not have theretofore. And also, naked skin is wonderful to touch. Primates of all kinds touch one another, and touch is very important. But naked skin, the touching of two bodies of mostly naked skin, bring together two people in ways that are not just nice sort of to talk about, but they are neurologically nice. We know from studies of the afferent nerve fibers in the nearly hairless skin of the body that when people come in close contact with one another, specific afferents called C afferents are activated, and these bring about a cascade of oxytocin release and possibly some other neurotransmitters which help people to bind one another together. Famously, infants and mothers, but also people of all kinds who come together and touch one another. So touch becomes ever more important as a medium of human communication and bonding, and decoration of naked skin becomes extremely important for long distance communication of our identity and intentions.
Right. I mean, what we have managed to do with our naked skin over the years, it's amazing to think about.
Yes,
But
it is.
then,
And, you know, we normally don't think about these things at all, but it's wonderful to contemplate.
exactly. But then your group also with, of course, your collaborators, you guys also did something interesting with our naked skin, taking skin pigmentation and getting this hairy timeline. So
Yes. Well, I think the hairy timeline is a very useful diagram, a useful graphic to show to people, because it shows how we basically lost our hair through the course of evolution and we gained pigment in our skin during the course of evolution. And this was a nice evolutionary trade-off. So I love the hairy timeline because it gives people a quick impression of the evolution of human skin.
yes, I think it's really important to discuss that, like how do we get something like this, something like hairy timeline? What sort of evidence that we use to construct
Well,
it?
and this is really important for those of you who are pursuing science or interested in it, is that a simple reconstruction like this is based on lots of evidence from anatomy, comparative physiology, as well as lots of evidence from the fossil record, including reconstructions of the likely activity patterns of our ancestors, and knowledge of the paleo environment and paleoclimate of the past. And last but certainly not least, we now rely on an enormous wealth of data from genetics, genomics, and bioinformatics, especially with respect to learning about the genes that have directed the evolution of nakedness and those that have been influential in pigmentation changes. And we now recognize in the latter category of pigmentation genes, there are dozens of genes that have effects on human pigmentation. And various of these genes have been more important in certain populations than others. So that behind that simple graphic hairy timeline is a wealth of information that we have distilled.
Indeed, but it's important to mention, for example, of course, that we don't get skin in the fossils, right? So then
That's
how do we
right.
get the data? Yeah.
Yes, we do have some preserved skin. There is some mummified skin and some frozen skin from individuals from about 5,000 or 7,000 years ago, but this is about the oldest actual skin that we have. But what we can do in the case of studying human skin diversity is look at skin genes. We can look at genes related to epidermal function or the structure of particular components of the skin, such as the stem cells in the skin. We can look at the pigmentation genes. We can look at all of these different genes in different populations and use our knowledge of the genetic changes that have occurred through time to figure out what likely happened at what time and in what populations. This methodology for comparative functional genomics has evolved technologically within the last 20 years to a very high degree. So we can now make good hypotheses about what the original state was, let's say for early members of the genus Homo, for particular genetic loci, and what happened in particular places through time. And one of the most fascinating things that has emerged from this study is that in the evolution of skin pigmentation, we have a lot of examples of parallel evolution. That is, populations that have dispersed into different parts of the world, let's say Northwestern Europe and Northeastern Asia, they have undergone loss of pigmentation in their skin as the result of largely independent genetic mutations. So this is just a beautiful example of natural selection in action. The importance of having depigmented skin under low ultraviolet radiation regimes is great because of the importance of the skin's ability to make vitamin D from available ultraviolet radiation. And so evidence of parallel loss of pigmentation in populations that were dispersing into high latitudes is really fascinating. And similarly, we find evidence of multiple instances of redarkening, of populations developing greater tanning abilities, as well as enhanced baseline skin pigmentation as a result of dispersing back into latitudes that receive a lot of UV. So this study of historical and functional genomics has really allowed us to get a detailed picture of what was likely happening when.
Interesting. Yeah. So since you already mentioned about vitamin D, probably we can just briefly talk about importance of vitamin D. That's one thing. But also, so once the sapiens were moving like beyond the equator range areas, how they survived, those kind of low deficiencies of vitamin D.
I think it's always important to remember that hominins that were dispersing, whether we're talking about early members of the genus Homo or most especially Homo sapiens, that they were undergoing biological changes and they were culture bearing. So they weren't sort of empty biological vessels. They were doing things. They had some technology and some ability to modify their own behavior according to the places they were living in. So what we see in the course of human evolution is a lot of what we call biocultural evolution, genetic as well as cultural changes. Now, in the case of populations dispersing into northern latitudes, these areas with relatively low and highly seasonal ultraviolet radiation regimes were really challenging to human populations. And what we see are not only genetic changes occurring in people, but also changes occurring in their diet. Vitamin D is incredibly important with respect to making it possible for the body to absorb calcium from the diet. So if you can't absorb calcium, you can't make a strong skeleton or a musculoskeletal system. You can't have good immune system activity. Almost every organ system in the body requires vitamin D for its normal activity. So vitamin D is not something that's negotiable. We really need it. And we either have to get it by synthesizing it in our skin from short wavelength ultraviolet radiation or consuming vitamin D in our diet. And the beautiful thing we see in populations of people dispersing into high latitudes is we see both genetic changes and dietary changes as people focus on increasingly high vitamin D sources of food like oily fish or marine mammals or some terrestrial mammals like reindeer and caribou that have a lot of vitamin D in their muscle meat. So this is one of the really fascinating things about studying humans is that you have these biological changes that would have occurred in any lineage of mammal, but then you have all of these cultural adjustments, not only to behaviors, but to the foods that are being eaten and sought after. So that some populations, for instance, the circumpolar populations, are really locked in to a biocultural adaptation of high vitamin D intake in order to stay healthy and reproductively successful at these extreme high latitudes.
Interesting. Yeah. So the what about other primates or apes? Do they have a similar sort of skin variation, or they are just because of the hairs, they are simply more protected?
We do see variation. Now, we don't have quite as extreme a level of variation, but we certainly see mostly darkly pigmented skin as well as dark hair among equatorial primates, and then lighter skin and hair among primates living at slightly higher latitudes. Now, we don't have any primates that live at extreme high latitudes or extreme low latitudes because they don't have the benefit of culture. They can't make shelters, build fires, although Japanese macaques do use hot springs to stay warm in the winter. And that certainly is a traditional behavior that they transmit culturally from one generation to another. But for the most part, these animals cannot construct cultures, material cultures that are as protective as ours. But we do see these patterns of gradients from dark to light pigmentation in primates as well as in non-human primates, in primates as well as in non-primate mammals.
Yeah. And is there any other example of any other species going through the similar course of evolution, like losing its fur and similar changes in skin pigmentation?
Well, we know, lots of lineages of mammals have lost their fur. All the marine mammals, for instance, but for a completely different reason, for the streamlining of and the needs of the aquatic environment. And for instance, naked mole rats have lost their fur as they have adopted a mostly subterranean lifestyle. But no other terrestrial mammals have become naked in the same way. And what's fascinating here is that in order to understand why this didn't happen, we need to understand how mammals stay cool in hot places, because a lot of mammals do manage to remain active, just like early hominins did, in equatorial African environments while having a big fur coat. And this is because there are different mechanisms in different major lineages of mammals for keeping the body cool, and most especially for keeping the brain cool. But it just so happens that primates do not have the same specializations of cranial blood flow that many of these other mammalian lineages, like carnivores and ungulates, have. And so the only way that we can stay cool, all primates, is through what we call whole body cooling, basically loss of heat via conduction and radiation and evaporation from the whole surface of our body. That's why when our lineage became more active in early years of the genus Homo, we basically had to lose our hair as the only way that we could stay on this trajectory of increased activity and still survive. So losing hair, gaining eccrine sweat glands, and gaining pigmentation was the way that we solved this problem.
Yes, but still we managed to sort of keep hairs at certain part of our bodies.
Yes,
Uh,
and actually, you know, we have, when you look at our bodies carefully, we have tiny, tiny little hairs all over our bodies. These little vellus hairs are in their own hair follicles, and these follicles are incredibly important because they are niches of stem cells that are important for wound healing and wound repair. So we don't want to lose all of our hair by any means, but certainly we've retained obvious thick hair on top of our heads as scalp hair, as well as on different other parts of our body, in our armpits, in our groin, and for men, some facial hair, mustache and beard hair. And the reasons for retaining these different batches of hair are very, very interesting. I did a little video a few years ago with the TEDx program, and we did a little animation of this. This was a lot of fun. And we basically talked about the importance of scalp hair for helping us maintain a cool head under the hot sun. But also we talked about the importance of eyebrows in helping to magnify the appearance of facial expressions, especially the expressions of our eyes. And also in men, the presence of mustache and beard in order to be able to show when sexual maturity is reached. And also as men age, their beard gets lighter in color, indicating their loss of vigor. Although some men with gray beards would probably take exception to what I've just said. But these certainly in men were important visual signals. We can't prove this. We can't run the video of from hundreds of thousands of years ago back to understand the social interactions of the past. But we know that these facial hairs are important visual signals for people, as is scalp hair and other body coverings or body paints or tattoos that we place on our body.
Yeah, and how important it can be simply for survival. I remember reading one of the examples in some book where the author was explaining the importance of the eyebrows. That if you, let's say, are doing long sprints, then even a drop of sweat can simply, or the importance of eyelashes, that even a single
Yes.
drop of sweat can change your
Yes.
rhythm. And yeah.
And so eyebrows help to protect the eye from sweat, and they also serve this very important signaling function because they are so expressive and so visible from a long distance.
Yeah. So the question is, what do you think about skin pigmentation? Whether it is it is selected. I mean, it was selected, of course, through reproduction, but how important it is for the survival itself?
Well, certainly in the past, our skin pigmentation was incredibly important because if we think about humans even 40 or 50,000 years ago, not that long in terms of evolution, we had mostly no clothes, no shelters, and we lived mostly outside and were exposed, most of our bodies were exposed to ambient temperatures and the elements, including ultraviolet radiation. And so skin pigmentation was the front line of defense against ultraviolet radiation. And our skin itself, the epidermal barrier layer, was the front line against most other environmental assaults, moisture, pathogens, thorns, you name it, all sorts of things that might cause abrasion or infection. So these features of the skin pigmentation and the properties of the barrier layer of the skin were incredibly important to survival and reproductive success in people, especially before the built environment and sewn clothing began to become major features of our lives beginning around 20 or 30,000 years ago. So today, one of the interesting things is that, of course, people are moving around all over the place. The situation has changed because we now don't stay in one place. We move around, and many of us live in places very far removed from where our ancestors lived even 500 years ago or so. And so we now have to think about, okay, well, what function is this serving now? Well, basically, we have these interesting evolutionary relics. We have our skin pigmentation, which reflects the ultraviolet regimes of our ancestors, wherever they might have been. And we can look at how closely or not so closely matched we are to the environments in which we live today. Some of us live very far away from the lands of our ancestors. One of the things we know for certain today is that most of us, including you and me on this podcast, are living indoors. We can spend days not going outdoors. This was unheard of, even in our recent evolutionary past. The fact that we are so out of touch with the natural environment, with the seasons, with the rising and setting of the sun. These changes have had major consequences for our activity levels, the nature of our activities, and our relationship with the sun. So we now need to sort of look at our skin pigmentation in a different way, because until a few thousand years ago, basically the skin pigmentation was finely tuned to our lifestyle and position, our geographical position in the world. But now, for most of us, our skin pigmentation is out of tune with our lives. We're not outdoors. We're not engaging in outdoor foraging or hunting and gathering or even farming, most of us. We are indoors, engaging in day-to-day activities indoors. And so we now have to compensate, especially for the lost vitamin D that we can no longer make in our skin. So skin pigmentation is just endlessly fascinating because it has an important evolutionary history, which people should know, but also it has real implications for our health today and how we care for one another's health.
I was talking to one neuroscientist about nature-nurture debate, and she mentioned that there is always an appropriate nurture for your nature. So I think it's very important for people to understand that, that you need to find, of course, the important factors for your biology.
Yes. And, we as humans tend to think that we're so remarkably clever, that we know everything. We have fancy technology at our fingertips. We can stay healthy under all circumstances. It is remarkable how out of touch we are with our basic biology and how little we appreciate the drift that we have undertaken away from our circumstances of even a few hundred years ago. Our levels of activity, our patterns of sun exposure are completely different. And we really have to actively compensate for these by changes in our exercise regimes, in our diet, and by being aware that we cannot, for instance, easily go into the sun with impunity. Our skin, which is unused to being in the sun, can become burned very easily if we decide to go on holiday to a sunny place, for instance, things that we never had to think about a few thousand or even a few hundred years ago. Now we must think about very carefully.
Exactly. And of course, science is opening many doors here also. And let's put it out there that science slams any racial discrimination. There is no evidence, or at least that's what I expect, that there is no evidence so far that shows that there are changes in terms of racial status in the society, right?
Well, it has become a bit of a hackneyed expression to say that there are no races, but there are no races. And when we look at any of the physical traits of humans, we see that these traits are present in a gradient from one place to another. And further, that the traits are not all traveling together. There are not packages of discrete traits. So race is so wrong from so many perspectives that we constantly need to sort of tell ourselves this and tell ourselves that these historical and social constructions of race have led us to think about these things as being real entities. And these constructions have had very sad consequences for much of biological science and medical science. We can now recognize these and begin to take apart, really, the racial infrastructure of modern science. This will take decades of dedicated effort, but we must do it. And we can more easily do it if we can educate young people about the evolutionary history of skin color and the beautiful diversity of humans around them, and these interesting genetic stories that can be easily told to small children. And if we also impart to them at the same time information about how these categories of people were constructed. Kids understand how lies are perpetrated. They get it. They understand that people can be wrong and that a wrong person can spread lies very widely. They get this. So we now need to make this common knowledge. We teach this in our universities and in our graduate schools, and we disseminate this among professional scientists. But we have to get this into the grassroots education of the world so that young generations of people will be scientists themselves, scientists of themselves, and appreciate the beautiful diversity of humans, the beautiful seamless diversity of humans that we find all over the world.
Exactly. That reminds me one of your talks on power of touch, where you basically ask other people, just to touch each other in a way. And I think that's just it's a great message, that once you touch the other person, you will understand that there is no difference there. It's all we are all humans.
Yes, and things like touch are such unifying elements that mean a lot to people at all ages and in all places. When we look at all of the things that unify people, they are just enormous, and many of them have to do with the skin, how we touch one another, how we take care of infants and the elderly through touch, how we cherish each other through the appearance of our skin, through touching people, through reinforcing their pleasingness of appearance. There's so much that we all share. And there's so little that divides us, especially when we look at history. We see that the few things that do divide us were created in order to divide us into more separate, sort of seemingly distinct entities. Once we recognize that we have been duped, we can begin to overcome these lies.
Yes, I think the only ironical thing is that we are talking about touch during the times of a pandemic, which of course people should take care of it.
Yes, and this has been, of course, its own tragic story. When we hear, especially from early days in the pandemic, of many hundreds and thousands of people dying in hospitals and isolated, unable to be touched by loved ones or even their caregivers because of the infective nature of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So this has been a terrible deformation of our humanity, that we've had to be isolated from one another. I mean, I think it's wonderful that we have remote methods of communication and that we can speak to one another through podcasts and various kinds of remote videos. But I do miss being literally in touch with friends and colleagues and loved ones, because that is how we most meaningfully communicate with one another. If you want to really get through to someone in a meaningful, especially in a caring way, to be able to speak with them, hug them, and touch them in a reassuring way is the fastest and most direct way, and one of the most salient modes of human communication.
So in his book, Sapiens, Yuval Harari explains is something called imagined reality that we have, where humans can agree on something and we make it a reality for ourselves, but it's not real. For example, money, right?
Yes.
And let's talk about sort of what is the imagined reality for skin and what is the reality.
Yeah, I mean, the imagined reality is, of course, that people have partitioned themselves into groups according to skin color. This is a perfect example of an imagined reality. Just like, we have imagined that money has value, we have imagined that skin color has value. And in many parts of the world, we have imagined that lightly pigmented skin is somehow better and more valuable than darkly pigmented skin. So this is one of these mental, intellectual constructions that has had enormous weight. And we must now recognize it for what it is. It's like the emperor's new clothes. We have to now recognize that the emperor has no clothes, and that this particular imagined reality has done far more harm to millions of people through time than it has done any good.
Yeah. So this question is, I think, for scientists. So the thing is that, of course, science doesn't care about opinions, right? Science doesn't care about races or whatever we label it. So since you already mentioned about population genetics, and genetics is growing now to another extent, right? And there'll be a time where there'll be population genetics on different parts of the world to measure, especially people are interested in cognition and these kind of psychological elements, right? So are there any also sort of topics which we should be concerned about skin pigmentation?
Well, I think related to this question is the incredible importance for geneticists and genomicists to understand that much of their conception of human diversity today is still framed around these partitioned realities that we've created. For instance, when you look at sort of the HAP map, genetic diversity spectrum of the late part of the 20th century, we still have these ideas about the nature of segmented groups of people in the world with representing partitioned parts of diversity. And I think it is incumbent upon geneticists and genomicists to recognize that in order for them to understand truly the genetic diversity of the world, that they have to sample far more widely, as is being done now in many, many parts of the world, and that they recognize that some of the previous studies that were done to, quote, examine patterns of human variation assumed as a baseline that humans were divided already into racial or continental groups. So I think as we think about these genetic studies going forward on cognition, on even properties of the skin or whatever, we need to first dismantle our own intellectual infrastructure and critique it most severely so that we really recognize what pre-existing biases we might have in our own samples before we start looking for group-specific patterns. And I think also what we will see is that there are going to be tremendous epigenetic effects. We already know that there are some epigenetic effects on skin barrier functions because these are mediated by the microbiome of the skin. Similarly, with individual and so-called population differences in cognition, we're going to see the enormous importance of epigenetic effects, how nutrition, early life experience, stresses, and so forth affect these modalities. So I think the message here is to be really open-minded, to recognize the biases that have existed even in the most seemingly objective sciences and go from there constructively.
Yes, and from the same point, if you would like to pinpoint major questions today in science of skin.
Well, I think we still need to know a lot about it in pigmentation, how different different specialized hues of skin color evolved. We know that people in parts of the world have very darkly or very lightly pigmented skin, sometimes with conspicuous coloration, sort of darkish red or darkish almost blue-black or chocolatey brown colors. These subtle differences in color, we don't understand those, how they evolved. And so we want to know about these things. We also want to know more about these biocultural trade-offs. What happened in particular parts of the world at particular times? And were some populations, for instance, like the circumpolar people, able to develop pigmentation that seemingly doesn't fit with the latitude, but can be explained by other aspects of culture? And also, we need to understand if there are true examples of sexual selection in skin pigmentation. We know in some countries there's a real difference, a measurable difference between skin pigmentation in males and females, and that in particular countries, that difference is quite great. Was this due to actually methodical preference of one sex for lighter members of another sex? We still don't know this, and this needs to be tested. So there are many, many things with respect to skin pigmentation, properties of the skin barrier layer, properties of the dermis related to aging, many, many things, as well as I would love to know more about exactly when the high density of eccrine sweat glands evolved on the surface of the skin. We have some idea that it occurred in the last few million years, but we don't know exactly when and exactly how this occurred. So I can't wait for some evolutionary developmental geneticists and historical functional genomicists to get going and work on these questions.
I think this is a great information for the scientists. And please also briefly describe information for the social workers who are, I mean, you've been doing an amazing work working with children to educate them more about their skin color, skin pigmentation. So if you can please describe
Well,
that.
I think for teachers and social workers and parents, it's important to recognize that you can tell kids about the evolution of skin and they get it, because the basic story about the strength of the sun and the pigment melanin as a natural sunscreen is really easy for people to grasp. So it's easy for kids to understand why people with darkly pigmented and lightly pigmented skin evolved. So it's just super important that this be propagated in every sort of living room and kitchen in the world, so that kids can understand, oh, that's why I'm the color I am. And when someone says to them, oh, you're too light or you're too dark, and it comes to them with some kind of value judgment on their skin, if they've had a simple history lesson about the prejudiced people who created race categories and who got people to think about a hierarchy of color, then they won't worry. They will say, my skin is beautiful, regardless of the color, because it evolved according to the strength of the sun, and it is beautiful just the way it is.
Okay, so before I let you go, would you like to mention where people can contact you and if they want to participate in some of your programs?
Yes, anyone can reach me through my email, which you can just look up my name on the internet and my details, my websites. At Penn State University will come up. There are a few different ones that provide a lot of different primary resources for the science that I'm describing. And I'm also always available to answer questions via email. Also, there is a wonderful site for teachers and parents called fyrclassroom.org, Finding Your Roots Classroom. And this site has many video webisodes that discusses the evolution of humans and human DNA and diversity of human traits of all kinds. It also provides a downloadable curriculum in various forms and downloadable lessons, especially for parents and learners who are home during the pandemic and trying to figure out, how can I do something creative in my home? We have some lessons for you to work at home, and they should be very fulfilling. So when you view these or work on the lessons in association with the videos, you will have a lot of fun and learn a lot.
Yes, great. I checked your Find Your Roots program, and what you guys are doing, it's amazing. Okay.
And these things can happen in everyone's neighborhood. It doesn't require any kind of special technology. The simple lessons can be done by anyone, anywhere.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you for accepting the invitation, coming on the podcast and sharing your views on different topics that you are working on.
And thank you very much for the excellent preparation and for inviting me to be part of this important podcast. A great
Thank you so
pleasure.
much.